Hello, friends. Hello there, everybody. I'm LD Madeira, and welcome to another amazing episode of Improv and Magic. This is the podcast that celebrates improvisers and magicians in the same show, and today's episode promises to be an extra special one. Today, I'm joined by one of my all-time heroes in magic. He's a legend, he's one of the most respected in the business, he's a true inspiration. My friends, today's guest is none other than Jamy Ian Swiss. Jamy is a master of sleight-of-hand, a celebrated author, and a respected magic historian. He's mesmerized audiences across the globe, from the Magic Castle in Hollywood to the Smithsonian Institution. Jamy is known for his razor-sharp technique and thought-provoking insights, and has contributed to numerous books, including Shattering Illusions and Preserving Mystery. He's had numerous television appearances, including one of the best magic documentaries, The Art of Magic, on PBS. Jamy Ian Swiss is also a passionate advocate for skepticism and critical thinking, making him a major figure in both magic and intellectual communities. In today's interview, Jamy and I take a deep dive into his journey and his philosophy on the art of deception. Whether you're a magician, an improviser, an entertainer, or just someone who loves good entertainment, there's so many great takeaways from this conversation. As a magician and a fan, this was an absolute honor for me. And it's now my honor to share this conversation with you, my friends. Here now is the one and only Jamy Ian Swiss. Well, my friends, I am truly honored to have with me on Improv and Magic. He is truly one of the greatest of all time. He is the one and only Jamy Ian Swiss. Hello, Jamy. Thanks so much for being here.
Greetings, LD. My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
People know that you're a wonderful magician, lecturer, and author, but I understand that you also fancy yourself a pizza aficionado. Is that true?
Yeah, well, cooking is sort of a significant hobby of mine, has been for many years, also a practical responsibility. I've always done most of the cooking in the course of years of raising my three sons. And so I'm passionate about Italian cuisine. I'm not Italian, but I was raised with the influence. I love the country and I love the food. And I cook a great deal of authentic Italian cuisine, but I also, in my sort of subsets of food passions, I'm also serious about craft cocktails and about coffee, about espresso, and particularly about pizza. I got very serious about pizza a few years ago. Met a wonderful guy through magic circles, actually, named Adam Sachs, an attorney in San Francisco and also a magician and also a very serious baker who is a colleague of Tony Gimignani, who owns Tony's Pizza Napolitano in San Francisco and a quantity of other restaurants around the western United States, and is a guy who is really almost single-handedly responsible for transforming pizza in the United States over the last decade. And Adam and I became very good friends, and he became my sort of craft pizza mentor. So I'm kind of hardcore about pizza. And as a matter of fact, as we are talking, I was just in San Francisco with my wife and my youngest for a couple of days, long weekend, and Sunday night got together with a bunch of magician friends, and we went to the flagship restaurant, Tony's Pizza Napolitana, and pizzaed out. It's the greatest pizza restaurant in America. There's no place else like it really anywhere in the world. So yeah, I'm a pizza. I could easily spend an hour talking to you about pizza.
So who's got the better pizza, New York or Chicago?
Oh, well, you could have caused me pause for a moment if the second one hadn't been Chicago, if there had been some other possibilities there. But Chicago's not really worth talking about. They make that thing, that pizza casserole dish that they humorously refer to as a pizza, but Yeah, I don't really think there's even any competition there. And I will say that I have been dragged around to a number of deep dish places in Chicago and was never impressed until finally I was taken to Pisano's. And Pisano is of a much higher order. And so I did enjoy, the only deep dish I've ever enjoyed was at Pisano's, but it's very low down on my list of favorites. We were just at Tony's. As I said, we had 6 different styles on the table for the 9 of us, and I was talking to Adam the next day, and I could have easily gone back and done completely different meals of entirely pizza, different styles, for 2 more times before I would have even considered duplicating anything. And deep dish would have been on none of those 3 meals.
So what does make the perfect pizza? Like for you, when you're crafting the perfect pizza, what is Jamie's version of a perfect slice of pizza?
Well, I mean, craft pizza has everything to do with the dough. The thing that's interesting about pizza is that it is both cooking and baking. The bread, the basis of it is baking, and then what goes on top of it is cooking. And I already had the cooking down and very comfortable with all that and the various sorts of ingredients. Not that I really go for a great deal in the way of toppings. I'm somewhat narrow in my tastes. But the bread I had to learn from new. I'd never been a baker. And so, pizza is, it's bread, sauce, and cheese. So it's like Woody Allen said about sex, even when it's bad, it's good. But the thing that passes for many people's idea of pizza, whether it's out or in the home, is very often not really of a serious quality. So serious quality has to do, like everything else, with the quality of the basic ingredients, but then in the handling. Dough depends on proper handling, and then it also is particularly dependent on what kind of starters you're using and how long is the ferment. So I go for a long cold ferment. My ideal target is 72 hours. Usually I'll make enough dough for 2 nights of pizza, so I'll typically do one bake at 48 hours and one bake at 72. So that has a lot to do with creating the structure of an airy, light, what's called digestible bread. And that really, the bread is part of the flavor. The toppings are really an enhancement. They're kind of like the way Italians use sauce on pasta. The dish is never about the sauce. The dish is about the pasta, and the topping, the sauce, is a condiment that flavors it and adds to it. But the texture and the flavor of the fundamental wheat grain, whether it's pasta or dough, is really the heart of the thing. So as far as varieties at home, I don't know. I'm particularly fond of, I make a New Jersey style tomato pie, which is just a reverse New Yorker style of sauce, of pizza, of cheese first, generally sliced low moisture mozzarella, and then sauce on top of that. And that's a very straightforward pizza that really celebrates the fundamental flavors. There's very little else on there. Finish it off with a little oregano and pecorino, and a touch of olive oil, but that's about all. And there's a handful of others that we make here at home. My youngest son loves my 4 cheese, which uses a bunch of different Italian cheeses. And I also like a puttanesca, which is one of my favorite pastas to make also, which is black olives and capers and real Italian anchovies. So anyway, but really it's about the craft, about the quality of the craft, the quality of the dough. There's no other restaurant like Tony's in San Francisco that I know of that has 13 different styles, using 7 different ovens. But here in San Diego, oddly enough, much to my surprise when I first moved here, San Diego is actually a very strong pizza town. And here, one of my favorite restaurant groups, privately held group called Buona Facchetta. They make authentic Neapolitan pizza in Italian-built ovens with Neapolitan-trained Italian pizzaiolas. We're there all the time. And then a direct connection to Tony Gimignani, a guy who was in the pizza business here in back east in Massachusetts. Then got friendly with Tony, and then sold his businesses, came to San Diego and opened a place called Square Pizza. His name is Freddie. And he has this little place in Pacific Beach called Square Pizza. They only make 3 kinds of pizza. They're all square, nothing's round. And he continues in the kind of Tony Gimignani tradition. When you walk in the store, you see right on the walls what his ingredients are, right on his website. What are his sauces? What are his cheeses? He sources all these ingredients from all over the country, and he does a long ferment. And his Sicilian pizza is as good as what Americans, New Yorkers refer to as Sicilian, is as good a pizza as I've ever eaten anywhere in my life.
I really hope I get invited to dinner with you someday. Well, before everyone gets hungry, let's jump right into your story, Jamy. So where did you grow up, and what was growing up like for you?
I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in Sheepshead Bay. Started in Flatbush, but moved to Sheepshead Bay when I was about 10, a small fishing village near Coney Island, where the water is too thick to drink and too thin to plow. And I was an only child until I was 10, and then that neighborhood, the home neighborhood changed, so to speak. But I really was raised as an overprotected, spoiled, only child. Went to a fascinating, unusual private elementary school called the Woodward School. Then moved to a public school for high school, Midwood High School, and then a very brief period at Brooklyn College, mostly long enough until they caught up with my student deferment, trying to stay out of Vietnam. So, and magic-wise, and I've told this story many times, and it's also in print in an essay in my first book called Real Secrets. I had all the qualifications to achieve excellence in magic. I was a fat, four-eyed kid with a speech impediment. So my parents were always introducing me to things as they said in the 50s, trying to bring me out of myself. And that included music. Started playing instruments when I was 7. And at the same time, I got introduced to magic because my father had a friend who was an amateur magician, did a trick for him. My dad asked where you find such a thing, and he was pointed to Tannen's, the original Tannen's Magic, when it was on 42nd Street and on the 12th floor of the Wurlitzer building across from Bryant Park, and run by Lou Tannen. And my dad went up there and described the trick, and it was the color vision box, the famous color vision box. And he bought one, learned how to do it, came and took my mother and I out for a dinner at a Chinese restaurant in Flatbush. And then after dinner performed the trick for me, which was quite astonishing because I did not know my dad to be a magician. And the only time he ever was a magician was when he would buy a new trick from Lou, learn it, and perform it for me. And this was a remarkable insight and idea on his part, because when you first get involved in magic, when you learn the secret, it's invariably disappointing. And it's also frightening to think that to have the confidence that you can fool somebody with it once you know how it works. And there's no more dramatic example of that than the color vision box, which is an example of nonlinear thinking as far as what the solution is. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. And by performing the trick for me, when I practiced it and I would be insecure and nervous about it, my dad would say, but remember how it fooled you? Remember how the magic felt? And that was a fantastic psychological and emotional talisman to hang on to. And that's the way I learned magic the first few years. It was periodic. I was very diligent about practicing, learning what to say. And I would master a new trick, and my dad would go get another one from Lou. And then by the time I was about 10, he started to bring me to the store on Saturdays, because Tannen's on Saturdays was like a magic convention. And the older I get, I was appreciative, by the time of my teens and 20s, but the older I get, I still grow more appreciative all the time of what I was exposed to, what I was around, the milieu, the professional and artistic milieu of magic that I was around at Tannen's. And it's really remarkable looking back on the lessons I learned there and who I learned them from. And that began with Lou himself, who was not only legendary as a talented demonstrator, but Lou, on a Saturday, the store could be filled with, names and professionals and people who were in town to be on the Sullivan Show the next night. But when I put down my hard-earned allowance money for a trick that was $1 or $2, then Lou would motion me over to the far corner of the store. He'd shoo other people away, and he would bestow that secret upon me. He never had to use words like respect or be secretive or protect us. He never had to tell me that stuff. It was implicit in the manner in which he conducted that exchange of information and that tradition. And that was invaluable. The idea that you would walk into a magic shop, see a demo and go, okay, how's it work? Or something was outrageous. I mean, that would never happen. So it was a fantastic environment to grow up in. And that was the start.
Were you certain at that moment that magic was the thing you wanted to devote your life to?
Oh, hell no. Anything but. Oh, no. It was the furthest thing from my mind. My parents raised me with a great interest and exposure to the arts. I was always at museums and theater and film. My mother started taking me to adult kind of mature films by the time I was 7 or 8. But all of that was considered separate from the idea of what you do for a living. And so I was raised with this very heavy bias, but I did not recognize it as a bias until much later in life, wildly later in life as an adult. But I was raised with this bias that the arts were not serious things you did for a living. You were going to be a doctor or a veterinarian or a scientist or some such thing. And it never occurred to me. And magic is really my third career, because when I was 17, I went into retail, and I was in the pet and aquarium retail industry for about 9 years. Into my 20s. I also played in a band, so the first money I ever made as a performer was as a musician. I started playing in a band when I was about 16, and I did that into my early 20s as well. And then when I walked away from that industry, I actually became a partner in a phone company that a couple of friends of mine were starting. They had the technical knowledge. I was more of a businessman and a salesperson. So I ran that for about 4 years, but I didn't have any real stake in it other than they made me a very good living. And then when I got out of that, by that time I was about 29, and I had been, among other things, I'd become friendly with Peter Samuelson in New York, and he had a big influence on me in terms of thinking about the artistic side of magic. And in return, as we became friends, I had served as a kind of a business advisor to him, but also more importantly as an artistic kind of collaborator and technical advisor, and eventually actually as a director. And I was involved with him sort of seeing a professional magician up close. That was the first time I'd ever been around someone, and he was also a contemporary. So I had a few years of being intently involved with that. I'd get done with work at the phone company a couple of days a week, and I'd end up going over to his place. He didn't live far from my office in Manhattan, and we'd work on magic. And so I was married. My first wife at the time had a very good career in the medical profession, and she said, you're still young enough. You can you can try this out now, and if it doesn't work out, you still can go on and find something else in your 30s, but you're always going to wonder what might have been, what could have been. So why don't I support us for a year, and you try to switch to magic. And that's what happened when I was 29. I took a year off, basically, kind of locked myself in a room, created a practice room, created a room in our apartment that was just devoted to magic. The library was there, the practice table were there, mirrors, everything. Kind of locked myself in the room and practiced for a year, and came out about a year later and did 2 corporate holiday gigs. And most of what I've done professionally in my life since then has been related to magic. Not just straight performing, although that was obviously the number one thing, but also writing, also consulting, also being a professional creative with or without magic in many, many other fields. I helped write a New York Times bestseller, The Art of Asking, written by my friend Amanda Palmer, who was a rock star. And I first helped her create her TED Talk by the same name, The Art of Asking, which went to a 13-minute talk that went instantly viral to 1 million views in 10 days. So I've done other creative work that's not strictly magic, but I've worked on magic for television and theater and film and other magicians as advisor, writer, director, and of course all the writing. So many, many different things, a kind of varied career. And conferences, I'm also busy in the conference world, and I was also busy for many years in the skeptic world, but all sort of mostly, not entirely, but with threads to magic ever since that, making that switch. Never had a real job after that.
So after you made that decision to devote yourself entirely to magic, can you recall any particular moment where you were doing a show and you were fooling people and you had that moment where you said to yourself, I definitely made the right choice?
Well, in terms of the right choices, that's an interesting question. But in terms of did I belong there doing that? I think that's the thing you worry about when you're in the arts, and especially because I started late professionally. I knew so many people who knew when they were very young that this is what they wanted to do, and I was starting very late. But after that year, I needed a way to contribute to the rent. I didn't just suddenly have shows to do. So I always liked hanging out in bars and performing in bars socially. And so I went to bartending school, and I started working in bars. And eventually, after the initial, start with the worst jobs and brunch shifts and all of that garbage, but eventually got a good job in a really good restaurant in the West Village. And my tips were... And they would allow me to do magic as long as I was keeping up with the work. And my tips were, half again or more as much as any other bartender because I was doing magic behind the bar. And I had heard of Magic Bar, the Chicago-style tradition of Magic Bar. I'd read about it, the Matt Schulian book, but I'd never seen it and didn't know exactly what it meant other than at that time to be doing close-up magic behind the bar. And then, oddly, through Peter Samuelson and a conversation he had at the Stevens Magic Competition in Las Vegas, it turns out that the Inn of Magic, originally the Brook Farm Inn of Magic, which was this wonderful club in Chevy Chase, Maryland, in a landmark building, where Bob Sheets had moved from Colorado and Steve Spill had moved from Colorado, where Sheets had been a street performer, and then he'd been a magic bartender and working at this legendary club, the Tower, that went on many years after him with other magicians, including Doc Eason and Eric Mead. But they moved to Washington, D.C., the suburbs. They opened this place, the Brook Farm of Magic. It became a phenomenon, and it featured Magic Bar, but also a dinner theater with a two-man show of Bob Sheets and Steve Spill, which was still to this day one of the 2 greatest comedy magic shows I've ever seen in my life, along with Penn and Teller. It was just a phenomenal show. And they were moving to larger quarters. They'd been quite successful, but the zoning made them close up early on Friday and Saturday nights. They had to empty out this booming bar business. So they brought in another financial investor. They moved to a big space in Wheaton, Maryland, and I came down and I auditioned at the Brook Farm when they were still at the Brook Farm. I auditioned, and eventually Bob hired me as the lead magic bartender. And I moved down there on very short notice and became the lead magic bartender at the world's largest magic bar. It was about 35 bar stools and two-tier bleacher seating that could hold about another 150, and that on Friday and Saturday nights was full for the pre-show crowd before they moved into the dinner theater. And I did magic 5 nights a week there for almost 2 years. And in Magic Bar, it's kind of like street magic or trade shows. You either get good or you get eaten, one or the other. And in answer to your question, magicians who were in the D.C. area would hear about the place, and they would come in and hang out and watch. And one night, Paul Gertner came in, who I had known sociably, collegially, not well, but collegially through Fectors, going to Fectors in the industry since probably 76, and this was now 85. And Paul came in, which made me a little nervous. And every time I looked up, he was there for watching another set. And I thought, well, wow, that's interesting. This guy, I don't know if I've even ever told Paul that story, because Paul and I are very good friends these days. But I thought, wow, he's watching me multiple times here. That's interesting. And then it was in the very earliest days of home video recorders, and a customer had a VHS recorder and said, can I record a set of you behind the bar? And I said, well, only if you make me a copy and you don't do anything with it. You can have a copy for yourself, but you can't copy it beyond that. And he said, okay, and he shot about a 30-minute set. And when I watched it on video, it was the first time I'd ever seen myself on video. When I watched it on video in that kind of detached way, I just thought, oh, this guy can do this stuff. Not this guy is great, but this guy can do this stuff. He's capable. So that's when I first felt that idea of being capable. Because when I changed careers, I had zero ambitions to become known in magic. I had no thought. I didn't have the slightest thought about that, because I had 2 successful careers before, and now I just wanted to see if I could make a living on something that I cared about a little more than the other things I had done. And that was my sole motivation. And it never occurred to me that I would end up, on the cover of Genie, or working lecturing at the Magic Castle, or getting compliments from the likes of Di Vernon and Al Goshman, or anything like that. That was the furthest thing from my mind.
While you were doing bar magic, what were some of the things that you were learning for yourself as you were doing that?
Well, the thing about bar magic, like I said, it's the same as street magic and trade show magic. You either get good or you get eaten. And in bar magic, you're competing with all this stuff. You're competing with drinks, first and foremost. You're competing with alcohol. You're competing with social dynamics, people trying to meet people busy engaged in conversation. You're competing with the background music, even though I ran it, but still, it's part of the crank and bar environment. So you're competing with all these things, and nobody paid a ticket. Nobody paid to see it. They might know that they're coming to a magic place if they bought the ticket for the show in the theater. But if they're just coming in for the bar, and even if they're coming to the theater, they don't necessarily think that they're going to see a show at the bar. And they see a guy making drinks, so there's no expectation. So you have to compete with all that and create a show, not just do a trick, but create a show. The idea, if you go, with all respect to people who work at the Magic Castle, and I like working the bar downstairs, the library bar, but it's basically most performers are doing close-up magic behind the bar. They're doing sets of close-up magic. And that's not exactly what the original Magic Bar tradition was. As a matter of fact, even at the Chicago Magic Lounge, where I've appeared, and I did a talk there just for the performers about the history of Magic Bar. And at the end, with their permission, I walked them all into the bar. The bar was not open at the time; it was during the day, and I did a little chunk of material from the legendary magic bartender Heba Haba Al Andrucci, who, along with Matt Shillian, are the originators of the Chicago style of magic bar. And that had to do with, just making a drink was an insane, outrageous comic performance. And you were always, in the original magic bar, you were, which came up in Chicago around a time of Prohibition and post-Prohibition. And it was intended to violate all the boundaries of social norms. I served drinks with my thumb in the glass. Here, pick it up. That's the least of it. So that idea of magic bar is different than really what's going on today, even in a place like Chicago Magic Lounge, which rightly celebrates that historical tradition. That's something I think is great that they do there. But it's not what real magic bar was. So at the time, I was fortunate because Bob Sheets had worked for a year with Heba Haba Al in Chicago before Bob went to Colorado. And he did all of Heba's stuff with Heba's permission. He did all of Heba's crazy, clowny, lunatic, norm-violating stuff behind the bar. And this was the 80s, and so that was, before the sea change in cultural mores about drinking, cultural mores about certain kinds of humor, cultural mores about smoking even, among other things. And so it was before AIDS also, which created a different sensation after that about safety and cleanliness and things like that, that had a ripple effect. And so although they did not put this in at the Inn of Magic, at the Brook Farm Inn of Magic, they had a barber chair. This came from the Tower. This is an idea that they did at the Tower. They had a barber chair, an old-fashioned barber chair at the bar that you'd get a guy, if they ordered a upside-down margarita, it was called, down at the end of the bar, and they'd sit in the chair with the back to the bar and lean back, open the guy's mouth, and now the bartender would make a margarita in the guy's mouth, shut his mouth, shake his head, and he'd swallow it. So it was a different time, let me tell you. So even though I had to, unlearn some of that when I then moved on to the corporate platform, the corporate environment, and all of that, and some don't make that transition well, by the way, from the street or the bar to the corporate platform, because they think they have to work the same way. You really have to make some adjustments. But I did learn to work strong. I did learn to seize an audience's attention. I learned to work for close-up. I learned to work to the entire crowd. I learned to do close-up magic for 150 people. How do you do that? Well, I can actually do that, but there are some techniques for it. It's not about necessarily making the magic bigger. I'm talking about close-up magic, but there's a way to... It's the same thing you do at a trade show. It really prepared me for trade shows in particular. I never was a street magician. Magicians often thought I was because of my look in those days, but I never did magic on the street. I didn't have the patience for it. I would have been in fights all the time. So, but I did end up doing a lot of trade shows, and that's what you're doing in trade shows. You're doing in the Tulloch style. You're doing close-up magic on that little platform out on the edge of the aisle, but you are constantly drawing people, pulling people in, and freezing them, trying to lock them in. And so you cannot just talk to the two people in front of you. You have to constantly be talking to the outer row, and the outer row you should be constantly adding to. Those are very difficult skills. And that's part of what I learned as a magic bartender.
One of the things that I have always enjoyed about watching you perform is the personality that you give off. It's a very friendly personality, and it's a very warm and entertaining personality. Is that something that you continuously work at, or is that just you being natural?
Well, I think some magicians would laugh at the characterization of friendly and warm, I do like to think that it is a genuine undercurrent that has always been present in my work, but especially in my days as a magic bartender, I was pretty aggressive. I played this kind of almost a caricature New York character. I played to that, right? The accent's real, as I always say to people, and I used that because there was no hiding from it. So I absolutely used that, and I have a kind of there is an element of sort of streetwise macho to my work, but yes, over the years that has, and especially once I left Magic Bar, so that's a long time ago, everything immediately began to tone down and get a little more civil, I suppose you might even say. But also my style has evolved. Just as I've evolved as a person, my style as performance has evolved. And Tom Aries had an effect on me early on. I know Juan for a long time, 35 years or something. And his thinking had an impact on me in a focus of what my idea of magic was, and making things more intent and sometimes somewhat serious, and definitely that element of warmth and sort of as has been said about Eugene Berger, magic done that is not solemnly, but that is serious, and more even than Tom Aries by far. Eugene had a huge impact on me very early on. When he wrote the first pamphlet, Secrets and Mysteries, I got a hold of that through, actually oddly through Peter Samuelson, even though Peter didn't know who Eugene was, but they had a mutual friend who sent Peter a copy of Secrets and Mysteries, and I found it sitting at his apartment, and I said, can I borrow this? He hadn't even read it yet. And it was maybe a year after that. That was probably 82, and then maybe 83, I think. I went to Eugene lectured somewhere near New York in the outskirts of Long Island, and I went out there for the lecture, and Eugene and I rode the train back, the LIR back into the city. He signed my copy. It says something like, with thanks for an interesting conversation, I think it says. And Eugene and I became extremely good friends. We were really quite close for many, many years. And his thinking about the audience and his demeanor also had an impact on me. So, I mean, all these, it's not about copying any of these people, but it's about taking that and incorporating in my work. And then, I had already been a professional for some years before I actually personally met Johnny and Pam Thompson. And Johnny quickly became what Levent said after John's death, which was he was our last mentor. And when I thought I was done with mentors, then John became one more. And my relationship with John, which was very, very deep, I learned a lot, and I relearned in a different way, because I had been very much formed by Vernon from a distance. I did get to know Vernon late in his life, but really it wasn't about magic so much at that point. It was really about just getting to know the guy, the man. I had really been formed by Vernon through the books, through the literature, through all that thinking. And but I revisited Vernon's influence through John, because John's primary mentor was Charlie Miller, but also Vernon and Harry Reiser, who was a Vernon and Charlie guy. And so I revisited all that, and through Johnny deepened my understanding of Vernon's thinking. So I'm really a Vernon guy on very deep levels, very deep ways. And all of that goes into, your question is there's a style, there's an external style. Yes, I can be loud, I have this voice, I have this accent, I use all that. But when we talk about character in magic, people think that that's a painted on thing or an exterior thing. And in most cases, especially in close-up magic, that's not what it is or what it should be. There are exceptions when we see people like really talented actors and writers like John Lovick or Rob Zabrecky who are portraying these very specific, very contrived characters. But those are platform and stage characters by and large. Yes, they can do close-up in that character, but it's not the way most people are going to do close-up magic. It's not really what close-up magic even is meant for, because part of the wondrous nature, a unique nature of close-up magic as a performing art is the interactivity with the audience. So it's difficult to play these kind of arch, contrived characters, and what you're really playing is a version of yourself, an edited version, where you're exaggerating your strengths, compressing your weaknesses, And it was a conversation with Teller many, many years ago. I did a lot of work with Penn and Teller over the years and was good friends with them. And it was a conversation with Teller one day where he made an offhanded remark, maybe not entirely offhand, but we were talking about a piece I was working on that he had seen me do. And he just offhandedly said, well, I sort of see you as you're different from John. And he talked about John, and then he said, I see you more as a street smart professor. And when he said those words and put those two things together, which don't really go together, when he put those two things together, it was the thing I was working on stand-up in the early period of working on platform magic in those days when this happened. And that set me on the path of figuring out what the hell I was really trying to do on stage and should be doing on stage. And so I've used that as a guideline throughout my work on stage ever since, which is, on the one hand, there is this kind of macho, feet on the ground, people perceive the idea that I have access to worlds and subcultures and places they've never been in, and that's true. But also at the same time, they understand that when I say something, a fact, when I give a piece of information, I'm doing so with a kind of authority and expertise and intellectual precision of language and thought, and I'm not just making crap up. I'm not just saying things to be pleasant or to be, cute in the moment. That's not what I'm about. And that's not what I'm about on stage or off.
I remember reading a quote from you where you say that as a magician, fooling people is only the beginning. Could you kind of explain what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, well, every art has its minimum definition, the thing it does. So a painter makes marks on a canvas, and a dancer moves across a stage, and a musician makes sounds with an instrument, and a magician fools people. But none of those other arts are defined by the form. The question of the quality of the art has to do with the fact that the form is a medium that the artist uses through which to communicate something to the audience, communicate something other than itself. And this is where magicians and variety arts in general have tended to stop traditionally. That the form is the thing. I fooled you, I'm done. Kind of like juggling. I did 9 balls. I don't need to do anything else. But really, what audiences crave from a live performer of any type, musician, comedian, is they want to know the performer's point of view about what the performer is doing. What do you think about what you're doing? What's your idea of what you're doing? And if you have an idea about what you're doing and you communicate that, not just explicitly, but more importantly, implicitly in many ways, then the audience will detect you have that point of view, and they will then formulate their own point of view about it. Might not agree with yours, they might not even like it, but they will formulate it because they have something. They sense that there's something there. There's a there, if you will, to deal with, right? But countless magicians, I dare say most, have never thought about most of that. They just want to do the trick and get a reaction and fool someone. And audiences sense that. And when they sense that the magician doesn't have a deeper idea, or something deeper to communicate, or doesn't have some more interesting layers to what he or she is doing, or doesn't care about what they're saying. They're just sort of blathering, noise from the mouth to fill the empty space. Audiences are very sensitive to that. They detect it right away, and they respond accordingly. It doesn't really mean they won't watch the trick or laugh at a joke, but this is where they very often default to trying to figure out the trick, because you haven't given them anything else to think about, right? So yeah, fooling is a start, just like the form of any art is the start. And the reason we learn craft, the reason we learn technique, the reason we learn skills is that learning skills is the vocabulary that we use to communicate an idea. And the communicating ideas through art is very, very difficult, and it's different in various arts. Jazz is a notoriously intellectual art form, but it doesn't communicate the same ideas as some other intellectual art form like theater or narrative literature or whatever the case may be, right? So the ideas you can even communicate are integral to the vocabulary you develop. But the more vocabulary you develop, meaning the more the greater level at which you master your craft, you now have more ability to communicate ideas, and then you have to have ideas that are worth communicating. It all starts to sound very, very difficult when you really think about it that way, and son of a gun, so it is.
If you were to look at all of the categories that you would put in the performance art umbrella, or if there were like a performance art hierarchy, I think it's safe to say that for a while, magic may have been considered a bit lower on that list. Do you think that maybe that's changing now because we're seeing a lot more magicians coming out, and because there's a lot more exposure to magicians because of shows like America's Got Talent and all those? Do you think that that's changing now and magic is becoming a lot more in the forefront than it was before?
Certainly, historically, magic was always low on the list, just as in the hierarchy, just as variety arts in general were, And the word, jongleur in French, it was when Robert Houdin was writing, and when Robert Houdin says a magician is an actor playing playing the role of a magician, that wasn't the whole thing. He said he is not a mere manipulator. He's not just a juggler, right? And he was part of the reason that Robert Houdin became really so famous and legendary was not just because of the caliber of his magic shows or the ideas that he brought to the stage and the style and so on. He wasn't the only one doing that, but it was because he treated magic and talked about magic and communicated to the public about magic on a high level, that it had intellectual and artistic validity, legitimacy. And in many ways, that sort of starts with him. So yeah, I think, that the greatest value of Fool Us, of the Penn and Teller show, is that it is about art appreciation. I wrote, some years ago when I was writing for the Magicana site, I wrote a series called Take Two. I think it's 71 installments. And it's curated video accompanying essays of about 1,500 words, 2,000 words, mostly about particular performers, some contemporary, some historical. Sometimes it's about a particular style or a particular effect, but mostly it's about performers. And I wrote those essays really for magic fans. I never talked about method in any of those essays, but I talked about what made the magic good. And I would curate 3 to 5 videos to accompany it. That's still up there at the Magicana site under Take Two. And this was during the early years of Fool Us, and Penn in Fool Us is doing the same thing. He is ultimately, the subtext of Penn's commentary is always carrying the message that magic is an interpretive art, and that it's never the song, it's always the singer. Which, interestingly enough, is the entire subtext of the wonderful documentary that Penn produced and that Paul Provenza directed, called The Aristocrats, about the world's filthiest joke. And it's a fabulous documentary that is all about the work of comedy and how comedy is an interpretive art, and it's never the song, it's always the singer. So that's the same thing that Penn is talking about in Fool Us, is about the fact that magic is much like the Great American Songbook, right? The kind of things, the kind of music sung by Sinatra and Tony Bennett and Ella Fitzgerald and Mel Torme and all of the great lounge singers, that they work from a fundamental source of material, just like jazz musicians, modern jazz, and are reinterpreting the same core body of work. And magic is exactly the same way. And people have not been traditionally aware of that, and I think they've become much more aware of it thanks to Fool Us in particular, more than anything else. But also, concurrently, before David Blaine came along, all of the TV specials of magic on TV was done in the same format, a format that was started with Doug Henning and then expanded or polished somewhat by David Copperfield, and then in the specials like World's Greatest Magic and stuff that were produced by Gary Roulette, it was all the same format of the Las Vegas stage was the format. Even if you did a close-up trick, it was still on Las Vegas stage pretty much. That's the way you did it. The way you dealt with credibility, which is also always an issue with recorded magic. Magic on recorded media was you had a celebrity, had James Earl Jones looking into the camera and earnestly saying, everything you're going to see at home is exactly what you would see here. There's no editing or camera tricks. So until David Blaine came along, turned the camera on the audience to solve the credibility problem in a different way. But the other thing that he accomplished was it was the first time that close-up magic became recognized as a viable form on its own. It didn't need illusions. You didn't need to stuff women in boxes to get eyeballs on magic on TV. Those are the two most, they're both equally important. The form and the content. The content being close-up magic, the form being the camera on the street, on the crowd. It's quite revolutionary. And, in the early days of AGT, they didn't have magic on at all, or occasionally they'd use magic the way Letterman did, which was as food, But finally, it became apparent that the audience actually wanted to see it. Darren Brown told me years ago that without David Blaine, that without the Masked Magician, he never could have got his special because the Masked Magician found an audience in England, just the way it did here for a while, until it eventually wore itself out. And it demonstrated to the suits in England, to the TV channels, that there was an audience for magic. It didn't matter what the kind of magic was. And so the same thing happened with close-up magic and David and Fool Us. And then AGT eventually got smarter than its judges and realized, there's an audience for magic. Now, it's like everything else on EGT, it's very, very, it's the low end of the taste, gene pool. And everybody has to be 20-something. So there's all of the horrible things about AGT. But nevertheless, yes, at least it, as you say, it validates magic and close-up magic as something worth watching and paying a ticket for. And, we have, the most elite close-up magic venue in America is Speakeasy Magic in New York City, where people are paying up to $275 for a ticket to go see close-up magic. And there's really good reasons for that. And I think all of those things are on a continuum. If you had just opened your doors a decade ago and said, we're going to charge $300 for a ticket to see somebody doing card tricks, the world would have thought you were crazy. That's no longer the case.
One thing that is also well known about you is that not only are you a great performer and an author and lecturer, but you've also spent a lot of time teaching people how a lot of people use the tricks of magic to scam people. And you've talked very openly about people who are like, con artists on the streets. And of course, you've spoken out a lot against, people like psychics and mediums. And I know you spend a lot of time working with people like James Randi.
Yep.
For you, why is that such an important thing to get across to people?
Well, everything, every life has moral implications. Every human act has moral implications. Some more, some less. But in the end, every day is a series of moral, ethical choices. You make the world a better place or you make it a worse one. There's no such thing as not having any impact at all. No such thing as neutral. There's no such thing as standing in one place. You either go forward or back. You either contribute to the betterment or the worsening of the world. Some fields have more direct connection to those issues than others. Medicine, science, law enforcement, legal system, and magic, oddly enough, because magic is an art that is deeply connected to the idea of deception, but it's a uniquely ethical deception, especially when it comes to conjuring, because conjuring is an innately secular art. If you don't understand that a woman is not supposed to float in the air, and that it's impossible to have someone float in the air and pass a hoop over them, if you don't understand that that's fundamentally impossible according to the laws of the universe, the universal laws of the cosmos, physical laws of the cosmos, if you don't understand that, then you don't appreciate it. You just go, ooh, ah, and or maybe worse, you end up, worshiping a new god that day. So the secular nature of conjuring goes back a long, long way, much longer than the recorded history. And so it gives us this innate connection to the misuses of those skills. And the abuse and misuse of those skills can victimize people in a number of ways, especially in the world of con games, especially in the world of phony psychics. That's redundant, but you take my meaning. And when I was a boy, and I read about Harry Houdini when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, I was not initially taken with the escapes. That didn't really do anything for me. That didn't grab me at first. What grabbed me was his campaigns of exposing phony psychics. From as long as I can remember, I had an obsession with the idea of the truth. What is the truth and how do we know what it is? And so I was a science buff from being very, very young. And I got interested in this idea of exposing phony psychics and so forth by reading about Houdini and spiritualism, an era which fascinates me to this day. I still do talks about it, not just in the skeptic world, other places as well, universities and so on. And so that was really interesting to me from the very, very beginning. And the more I was exposed to it, I didn't really tip over into my own sense of personal outrage about it, right? I really didn't get my sense of righteous indignation ignited until Uri Geller came on the scene in the 70s, and Randi, who I knew a little from seeing him on TV when I was a little boy on the famous New York kids show called Wonderama. But Randi wrote a book called The Magic of Uri Geller. That eventually title was changed in the later editions, the current editions. And now I can't think of what the current title is, but it was originally The Magic of Uri Geller, which was a really beautifully ironic title, because that's what Geller was doing. He was doing magic tricks, so it's really a great title. And Randi exposed him. And when I read Randi's book, and there are many others of my age group of that time, my dear friend Banachek will tell you the exact same story of this book kind of radicalizing me and showing me not just, I wasn't surprised to learn that Geller was just doing tricks. Obviously he was just doing tricks. But he connected it, Randi connected it, as did Martin Gardner in his early books about skepticism, and many others. He connected it to real-world implications and how it preys on people and makes them vulnerable to many other kinds of scams and victimizations. And so I became interested in how all that stuff works. And over the years, I've, lectured to police and law enforcement about street scams, and I've done television, tons of television about it. And I was involved with the skeptic movement for many years, and I was a senior fellow at the Randi Foundation, and I helped to run. I was one of a handful of people, along with Banachek, along with the statistician Chip Denman, and a few others, and we ran the $1 Million Challenge together for many, many years, where we had $1 million in escrow available offered to anyone who could demonstrate a paranormal ability under mutually agreed upon test conditions. And so I was involved with all of that for many years. I've consulted occasionally on casino cheating and gaming for gaming companies, or gaming equipment companies. I'm really interested in deception in all of its very forms, and in how magic is set apart.
I've seen a lot of magicians who, when they perform, they don't say it's supernatural, but then again, they also don't say it's a trick either. They just kind of are wishy-washy about it, and they're like, well, who knows what it is? To you, is that just as bad?
Yeah, I mean, this is an ancient debate, and that will certainly never be resolved, because the world never has a shortage of people who are happy to embrace simple answers to complicated questions. And there is a simple answer to every complicated question, but it's usually wrong. So there's a big difference between conjuring. Mentalism is a form of magic. It's just another form of conjuring. Creates a particular kind of illusion. It's mental rather than physical. And the thing that makes conjuring interesting is the audience is, as I said before, it's a secular art. The audience is inherently aware that what they're seeing is impossible. This creates a kind of irony and cognitive dissonance that makes magic fascinating and unlike any other experience, literally unlike any other experience. Pop Hayden is one of my favorite writers about this subject, about defining what the magic experience is, and that it creates this cognitive dissonance, quoting Witt now, a burr under the saddle of the mind, right? That an audience will return to over and over again if they cannot resolve it. The best magic is unresolvable. And I'll quote Hayden again here. He says that the idealized form of magic, to me, the idyllic form of magic is to perch a spectator on the edge of a blade. On one side, it can't be magic because magic doesn't exist. On the other side, it must be magic because there's no other explanation. And if you can actually leave an audience perched there, where they can't comfortably resolve to one end or the other, it'll bother them over and over again. And that is what makes magic unique, and that is the highest form of magic, in my estimation, as an art. And it's very difficult to achieve, very difficult. And most magicians, my dear friend Max Maven, like to say that most magicians are afraid of magic, and they are afraid of leaving an audience in a discomforting place. The reason hacks become hacks is because they give the audience too much power, because above all they want to do is please people and get the next gig. That's all they care about. And so if you want to always please people and get the next gig, well, you don't want to make them uncomfortable and leave them with any sense of discomfort that they have to think about or whatever. And so you resolve it for them. You make a joke about it. You treat it as something stupid, right? You treat it as something goofy. And you release that tension before they even get to it, right? And that's how most magicians perform in one way or another, without committing to the sense of mystery, without committing to mystery. So I think that's the best of magic. Well, the problem is with mentalism is that people don't know as much about the paranormal as they do the science of the paranormal as they do about physical things like whether people can levitate, or whether you can break something and put it back together again, or whether matter can neither be created nor destroyed. Like, that's a thing that people inherently understand. And unfortunately, many people will go sit in the audience of a mentalism show and try and look to the performer for information about that. That's not where they should be looking. Just like they shouldn't be looking for information about news from social media. They should actually be seeking out quality sources. So they look for that information, and they are less certain. It's less obvious to them. And Teller wrote a wonderful piece, the introduction to one of Banachek's books, the first of the Psychological Subtleties series, about how, well, if somebody's born with psychic powers, then all you're looking at is a freak show. But if it's clear that nobody has psychic powers, including the performer, and yet he or she can create the absolutely convincing, compelling illusion of reading your mind, wow, that's really interesting. That's as interesting as watching somebody float. See? But most mentalists would prefer to play in the shallow, spongy end of the pool, where there's a little bit of religion and a little bit of mysticism mixed in. And as you say, they may not explicitly claim powers, but they also don't disclaim. Now, the PEA, Max used to say they are neither. They've always used the same excuses. Oh, you don't tell you don't tell people that there's not really a ghost under the bed. You don't tell people that the swords are fake or that there's. Well, you don't tell people that because they already know it. But in the mentalism show, they don't know it, right? They don't know it. And they often ask for guidance, whether it's in the show or after the show. And it takes a lot of personal strength of character, not just moral standing, but just sort of strength of character to say, it's all a very convincing illusion, and I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad you liked that feeling that created. But yes, and years ago, and this became much more pronounced after Darren Brown came on the scene, then mentalists just substituted one extraordinary claim for another. So instead of saying they're psychic, they're super influencers, they're readers of body language. It's all the same nonsense. It's all garbage. It's the same lies. And I like performers who are. I believe that I started by saying that every human life has ethical implications, choices, and decisions we make literally every day. And I think it's the first and foremost and primary responsibility of a human being to speak the truth as you see it. That's the most respectful thing we can do for our fellow human beings. Speak the truth as we see or know it. Right? And so if you're standing up on stage and you're drawing people to come to you and you're charging them money and all of this, then it's the least respectful thing to distort their understanding of reality. And it's the most respectful thing to tell them the truth when they ask you. And there have been and there are great mentalists who do tell the truth, but they are in the minority.
You mentioned all of these great people that you've had the opportunity to work with. Penn and Teller and Eugene Berger, James Randi, Lou Tannen, and you've had the opportunity throughout your career to work with a lot of these people who are legends, really. For you, how does it feel to know that you've had the opportunity to work with these amazing people?
Well, I'm constantly humbled by it. I mean, I really am. I remember. Well, this is actually not directly to your question, but because this has to do with a kind of self-aggrandizement. But I remember Tommy Mullica was a really good friend of mine, really good friend. And when we were in our 40s, our early 40s, and we were at a magic convention, and some young person came up and asked to take a picture with him. It was before cell phones, but I think the kid might have actually had a camera, or else he asked him to sign. Might have asked him to sign like a copy of Genie or something like that. Maybe that was it. And after the kid went away, Tommy turned to me and said, "Man, how weird is this? We grew up watching all those guys on the cover of Genie, and did we ever think, now we're those guys. Now we're turning into those guys." And so that's a weird thing that's a really weird thing by itself. That's just a really strange phenomenon, because I think one of the things that we feel my friends and colleagues who are accomplished magicians feel, or at least I feel, is I'll never be up to my mentors. I'll never be at the level my mentors were. I'll never, when you lose a Johnny Thompson or a Jay Marshall or a Billy McComb or a Patrick Page, it is each time a new Library of Alexandria burning to the ground. And I only have a few shelves of that library in my head. So I don't feel I can, this is not false humility. I despise false humility as a character trait. I do not feel I can measure up to those people. I just try my best. I remember Teller calling me on the phone once, many years ago. It was in the 90s, because I remember where I was living when I answered the phone, and he said, "Do you know anything about such and such a trick, whatever?" And I go, I don't really know much about that. You should call and off the top of my head, I said, "You should call the triumvirate," I said. And I used that word just off the top of my head, but he didn't have to ask me what I meant. He knew I meant McComb, Marshall, and Thompson. He knew that's what I meant. So I do not feel I can take the place of any of those men. I honestly do not. But I try the best I can. I find it moving when I am asked for counsel and advice by younger magicians. I spend a lot of my time these days, the last few years, consulting on shows. In the last year or two, I've worked on shows for Ossie Wynn, Luke Germain, David Gerard in the Bay Area, others. Someone who's doing a show right this week at the Castle I worked with for a few years. So that's a way of carrying that forward. That's a way of paying that forward, and feeling that. But yeah, I've been writing this Magicana series for the last year in Genie and gotten some very good feedback about it. It's been very, very hard work and very satisfying because I had a particular idea about what I wanted to do. And I'm writing the very last one now, which is number 13, which is the January 2025 issue, which will be the final issue of Richard Kaufman and Liz Kaufman running the magazine. And I knew at the beginning that I was going to close my final installment with an unpublished Derek Dingle trick. And in the past couple of weeks, I've been thinking a lot about Derek Dingle and writing about him. I'm in the midst of writing about him. And I am, still astonished at the strange gift that I was given, that as a kid who didn't know anything, hanging around at Tannen's on Saturday afternoons, I was too nervous, shy to talk to anybody, but I would look at a distance and I would see, among others, Derek Dingle, one of the greatest close-up magicians, sleight-of-hand magicians I've ever known in my life, a few feet away from me with a deck of cards in his hand. Yes, I still find that wondrous. I do.
Well, here's my last question for you, Jamy. What's the one piece of advice that has served you well that you'd want everyone else to hear?
1985, I met Steve Spill when I moved to D.C. Well, actually, I met him when I auditioned for the job at the Brook Farm Inn of Magic. And we became fast friends. We're good friends today. And Spill is one of the most original magicians I've ever known. Many magicians develop unique performance content, scripts and style, point of view. A good quantity of magicians develop advances in method, technique. Very, very few create effects. I can count them on one hand. People I've known, Teller, Gaten Bloom, Steve Spill, are three that come to mind. And Spill, who has done more shows than any probably 10 or 20 of your guests put together, in every conceivable venue, and his books reflect that, and his books are phenomenal. They're unprecedented and phenomenal. You really should get him on this show. Steve said to me in the course of conversation that I had with him in that period of time when I was around him for a few months, he said, "Good work is never wasted." And that is a sentence that I have come back to literally countless times in my life. And I have repeated, both in print and spoken word especially, to other magicians countless times. I wrote an essay once for Antimony magazine called What Works? And I started out with a story about overhearing a conversation between two magicians. And one guy is practicing some really difficult thing, and the other guy turns to him and says, I used to work on stuff like that. I don't work on stuff like that anymore. I got a SpongeBob routine that kills every time. I got a color change knife routine that absolutely works. I don't work on that hard stuff. And I turned to him and I said, why would you have more respect for your audience and for your art than to be so cavalier as to consider yourself a success just because you get a reaction, you do a trick that gets a consistent reaction? What was particularly interesting about that conversation, or I should say appalling, there were two boys about 10 years old. What works? I do what works. And I see this constantly with magicians who are either looking for the half a dozen or 10 standard tricks that they need to learn, that everybody else does, same tricks, just follow the path that went before them, and never learn anything else. 12 tricks in a job, the journeyman working magician. You can have a good career that way. Or who's always looking for the latest new thing in the river of downloadable shit that comes flowing at us, every day from the online sources. And Steve said, good work is never wasted. When I was a kid, and not just a young kid, but really through decades of my passion for magic, I always was learning something new. But when I was a kid, I wanted to learn everything. I wanted to learn everything just for the sake of doing it. I went through Tarbell from page 1 of volume 1 to the last page of volume 6, the original Tarbell. And that knowledge has served me well. When I worked as a consultant for TV shows, for Penn and Teller and Marco Tempest and others, wherever I traveled, I took Tarbell with me. And in the end, I discovered the incredible truth of Steve's comment, because there are things I do in my shows that I learned or developed either when I was terribly young and had no notion of working professionally. So I tell a story with torn and restored cigarette paper on stage that I sometimes close shows with, that I wrote that script when I was about 15, 16, after I met Al Coran and read his book and saw him perform. And then there was another period when I learned some of the impossible Cliff Green stuff from the wonderful Cliff Green book. Certainly had no commercial intent, and yet one of those pieces is a key routine that I have done on countless stages. So, because the day came when I thought, I wonder if I could use this thing. Maybe this thing would work there. This thing that I worked on years before. So, and it works with writing as well, with me as a writer, where I write things sometimes just because I need to write them, and I have no purpose in mind for it. And then it turns out I'm going to get a byline in the January-February issue of Reptiles magazine, another passionate part of my life that we haven't talked about, because I attended a unique conference and I decided to write 4,000 words about it, even though I had no purpose. And it turns out I'm going to have a byline in a Reptile magazine as a result. So good work is never wasted, and you can never do too much of it.
Well, Jamy, this has been a great pleasure and a huge honor. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you so much for doing this, and I hope one day to be able to taste one of your gourmet pizzas. Thank you so much, Jamy.
Nice talking to you, LD. A pleasure.
Indeed, good work is never wasted. You can never learn too much. You can never work too much if it's something you're passionate about. So keep doing good work no matter how much it is, and remember to enjoy the process. A very big thank you to Jamy Ian Swiss for being so generous with his time today. He's an incredible performer, and if you haven't seen him in action yet, you are definitely missing out, my friends. So be sure to learn all about him at his website, jamyianswiss.com, for shows, keynotes, and bookings. And be sure to also visit my new website, ldmadeira.com. Learn all about my improv shows, my magic shows, and my workshops, and feel free to get in touch. Thanks for listening, my friends. I had a great time with you as always, and I hope to see you again here on Improv and Magic. And don't forget, you are who you are, and you are special. Bye now.